Good morning. Today is the 5th day of first Adar, and it's the 14th of February. We're up to the 4th reading of Parshat Terumah. And what we're going to do today is we're actually going to connect the 2nd and 3rd readings together with the 4th. And this fits very nicely for the whole topic of the tabernacle, because everything in the tabernacle is a puzzle that you put together. So if you remember that 2 days ago we were talking about the covering of the ark and the cherubim that were on top of it, and we said that that was actually like the third focal point of the tabernacle, where the finite and the infinite come together. Then yesterday we were talking about the meaning of the word Kabbalah, which we learned from the description of the tapestries that were put together, the two sets of tapestries that were tied together, not by sewing them, but rather with these clasps that connected two sets of loops, the two loops that connected to the two sets of clasps on each one of the two tapestries. And this is like the picture you see here, the holes, and the holes are called lulaot. We'll talk about them in a moment. And the clasps are the krasim, they're called in Hebrew. In any case, so we learned that is the root of this, the original root of the word Kabbalah, which means to correspond things one to another. Today, in today's reading, we read about the walls of the tabernacle. The walls were made out of wood, which was plated with gold. And there were two methods by which the walls stood together. There were 20 planks on one side, 20 planks on another 6. So there were 26 plus 46 planks altogether. The one thing they had was these bases made out of silver. And the bases went underneath the planks. The way the planks were made was that they had these protrusions here, and you put two bases together, sort of like what you see here on top. They worked the same way on the top, and it connected them together. If you don't have these pictures, you can look up anywhere on the internet. You'll see how it works. It's an interlocking mechanism. It's very straightforward. But then there were also, apart from the bases holding the planks together, there were also crossbars. Each of these walls, each of the 20 planks, and 6 planks, had 5 crossbeams or crossbars running through them. So they had little, what do they call it? What would we call them? Like some kind of like holes through them that were drilled all the way through, and the crossbeams went inside. Now, why 5? Because the idea was that on top there were 2. On the top part of the wall, there were 2 crossbeams. One went in from one side, one went in from the other side, and they met in the middle. And the same thing was done towards the base. But then in the middle of the wall of planks, there was just one crossbeam that went from one end of the wall to the other. It was not divided into 2. Now, why was divided into 2 on the top and the bottom? Why wasn't divided into 2 in the middle? That's not our issue right now. What we'd like to do is we'd like to dwell on the language that the Torah uses to describe the middle beam, the middle crossbeam that goes all the way from one end of the wall to the other. And the Torah says the full-length crossbar at the wall's mid-height shall penetrate the holes drilled through the planks from one end to the other. And that's a very interesting way of saying it. Why is it so interesting? Because the way that it was interpreted over generations is that it's going from one end to the other, not of a wall, but of the entire structure. So you have like a U-shaped structure, a wall here, a wall here, and a wall here. And you've got a plank that starts here on this end, goes in, somehow turns the corner, and then does this wall, then turns the corner again and comes out at the end of the third wall. Now obviously, that's a certain interpretation of the words. The literal interpretation of the words should be that there were 3 middle cross beams, one for this wall, one for that wall, and one for the third wall. But again, throughout the generations, this is the way it was understood because it tolerates this understanding. This interpretation is definitely one of the 70 faces of Torah. That somehow this was a very special beam, and it was supernatural, and it was able to turn corners. Obviously, we could do that today, actually. We actually have things like that today. But I don't think that they did. So if there was any way that it could be done, it had to be done by some miracle. Now, why is this so interesting, and how does it tie into our 2 previous installments? We said yesterday that to create correspondences, you have to have an alignment between the 2 models that you're looking at. So if you have a model that has 50 holes, there should be another model with 50 holes, and then you can clasp them together. But what does it mean to have a hole? We didn't talk about that. What does it mean to have a hole? Here we just talked about these holes in the walls. There's a hole in the wall that goes from end to end, as it were, and it's navigated, actually circumnavigated all the way through all 3 walls, through this hole, and the middle crossbeam goes all the way through. It's the same type of idea. It's a hole that I'm going through. To connect, I need to make a hole. In order to be able to connect things together, there has to be a hole. In the previous installment, we were talking about the holes made on the tapestries, and then clasps connecting them together. But if you didn't make the holes, the loops, there was no way to actually connect the 2 sets of tapestries together. What this is saying is a very deep idea, that regardless of what we're talking about, in order to connect, there has to be a hole. The Tanya begins with an idea that King David was able to fully connect to God. How? Because he says, my heart is a hole. It's a void within me. Everything has a hole inside of it. Everything has a void within it. It's just a question of whether it recognizes it or doesn't. The hole is where things connect. And the Baal Shem Tov once described it like this. He said, give me any logical argument in the Talmud and I can tear it down. I can prove exactly the opposite. How's that possible? So he explained, he said, everything has a hole inside. In that hole, that thing is now connected to the totality of being. And so, if it's connected to the totality of being, it's also connected to its opposite. To say it another way, he said, if you prove one direction, you can also prove the other direction. You just have to get into the, let's call it the hole, let's call it a blind spot. There's a blind spot within everything. There's something that you can't see within everything, hiding within everything. That is where everything connects to totality. Every object, every idea, every thought has an emptiness inside, a void inside, which returns it to non-being. It returns it to the totality of everything being connected by God. That's the void inside, because everything is a thing, it's a being. In order to connect to the totality of everything else, there has to be a point inside it which is non-being. So it turns out that that point, that blind spot, is like a point of paradox. If you reach that point, you can move from one argument to the other. So the Baal Shem Tov said, if you give me any Talmudical argument, I can prove to you exactly the opposite, because I know how to find the blind spot inside. I know how to get there. And when I get there, I can move from there into a different argument and show you exactly the opposite. So this actually also ties into our first installment this week, that there are 70 faces to the Torah. How could the Torah contain 70 faces? 70 different interpretations. Because the Torah in every letter has an emptiness inside, a void inside, which is the infinite residing inside of it, the infinite non-being residing within it. What this means is that if we want to connect to the infinite, if we want to connect to the totality of being, we also, like King David, have to make a halal bikirbi, a void inside of myself, inside of my heart. That void is the willingness, the ability to void myself, to go beyond myself. That's what we talked about in the space between the cherubim. The space between the cherubim is an example of that void. It's a space which is neither being or non-being. It tolerates everything, but it's not this or that. It's the essence of being in a state of paradox, which is what the Shekhinah actually represents. It's the ability to be so flexible that I can always connect regardless of what my situation is. Because I can always void myself. I can always negate my being in such a way that I can emerge in a completely new way. This is what this crossbeam does. This crossbeam going through the holes of the planks and then navigating the whole way around is because it is the essence of paradox. In the Sfirot, we say, in the Sphiratic tree, we say that is the middle axis. The middle axis begins in the crown and ends in kingdom, and from top to bottom it's called the middle crossbeam, and it's assumed that it is the carrier of this void, of this infinite being, of this also infinite non-being. Each one of the Sfirot, from crown to knowledge, to beauty, to foundation, to kingdom, has this aspect in it. And so, what the Baal Shem Tov taught, and that's why people sometimes felt that he had made them forget their learning, he taught them how to see the void within everything they thought. Because God is beyond all our thoughts. That's exactly what this void is. It's what connects everything together into one thing. Like this middle crossbeam that goes through the holes and paradoxically is able to navigate around corners. But that's just a way of showing, it's not meant to be understood either literally or not literally. It's meant to be understood as a way of connecting even when it's not possible or it doesn't seem possible that things can connect. And that is the essence of the tabernacle. The tabernacle in all its particulars, everything we've seen this week, is trying to create a connection. It's not just trying, it's succeeding. To create that connection between the finite and the infinite, between the mundane and the supernal, by realizing, by finding that which is beyond both. That which is beyond the spiritual and the material, between that's beyond the finite and the infinite. The true state of paradox. And that was the central point of all the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov and the essence of what Chassidut is about. Thanks for joining today.